Don't shoot! Please, don't shoot him!
I wanna be with you.
The single sharp crack of the pistol echoed through the burning Harlem garden. It seemed to puncture the very sky. For Elias, the world didn't go black. It went white. A blinding high-frequency surge of terror that neutralized his loud joy instantly. The roar of the fire, the wail of the sirens, and the shouts of the neighbors all fell into a pressurized vacuum. In the center of that vacuum was Marcus Thorne, the architect, the man who lived in right angles and calculated the weight of the world, was crumpled in the deep black mud. His white dress shirt, once a beacon of sterile corporate order, was blooming with a jagged, wet crimson stain at the shoulder and chest. Elias didn't feel the soldier's grip on his arms loosen, but suddenly he was moving. He was across the mud, his mustard yellow linen shirt soaking up the soot and the blood as he collapsed beside Marcus. "Marcus! Marcus! Look at me!" Elias's voice was a ragged, raw sound that felt like it was tearing out of his chest. Marcus's eyes were open, but they were distant, fixed on the smoke-choked stars above Harlem. His breathing was a wet, hitching struggle, the sound of a machine failing its last stress test. The smell of copper was overwhelming, drowning out the rosemary and the kerosene. The general stood frozen, the silver pistol still smoking in his hand. For a man who had spent 40 years commanding the movement of thousands, he looked suddenly, pathetically small. The Sterling man was a ghost, a relic of a rigid era that was currently burning to ash around him. Before he could turn toward the black sedan or bark a command to his remaining man, the garden was flooded with a different kind of light. Not the orange of the fire, but the blinding, rhythmic strobe of blue and white. It bounced off the brick walls of the brownstones, turning the smoke into a frantic, pulsing ghost. NYPD, drop the weapon, hands where we can see them. Sloane Kensington stepped out of the lead cruiser before it even fully stopped, her heels clicking on the wet pavement with a sound like a gavel hitting a bench. She wasn't the shark in a silk dress tonight. She was a force of nature in a black tactical trench coat, her face a mask of lethal, focused precision. Beside her, Aunt Viv sat in the back of her Maybach, her silver-white hair glowing like a halo against the dark leather. They hadn't just called the police. They had brought the hammer of the state. While the general had been playing soldier in a warehouse, Sloane had been working with the district attorney and the FBI. The rogue operation hadn't just been monitored, it had been curated. Every move the general made had been recorded, time-stamped, and filed into a federal racketeering case that Sloane had been building since the moment Leo was first taken. The transition from chaos to custody was surgical, a masterclass in law enforcement efficiency. Officers swarmed Silas Vance, who sat in the mud a few feet away, staring at his blood-stained hands in a trance of realization. He looked at his son, Elias, huddled over a dying man, and for the first time, the wrecking ball of his conviction looked like a pile of rubble. Cynthia, who had been watching from the safety of her car, tried to reverse out of the block, only to find her path blocked by 3 unmarked federal SUVs that seemed to materialize from the shadows of the Harlem night. Sloane walked directly up to the general, ignoring the pistol on the ground. She didn't look at him with fear. She looked at him with the boredom one reserves for a solved math problem. "Vance Sterling," she said, her voice a low-frequency hum of triumph that cut through the roar of the fire trucks. You are under arrest for attempted murder, criminal forgery, arson, and racketeering. The marshals didn't release you because of a technicality, Vance. They released you so I could watch you walk yourself into a life sentence. We've had the LIC warehouse under surveillance for 48 hours. We have the plotter. We have the kerosene receipts. We even have the digital logs of the signature you forged. And now, we have the ballistics. The general's jaw worked, but no sound came out. His legacy hadn't just ended. It had been dismantled by the very laws he thought he was above. The ambulance ride was a blur of fluorescent lights and the smell of copper and ozone. Elias sat in the corner of the cramped, vibrating space, clutching Leo's small hand so tight it left white marks. The boy was eerily silent, his eyes fixed on the oxygen mask over Marcus's face, watching the plastic fog up and clear with every agonizing breath. The paramedics were working with a frantic, rhythmic efficiency, their hands moving in a dance Marcus would have appreciated for its precision if he were awake to see it. "He's losing too much volume," one medic shouted over the wail of the siren. "Vitals are crashing. We need a secondary line now. Pressure is 80/40 and dropping." Elias felt the Saturn transit he had joked about earlier becoming a physical weight, a literal wall of ice closing in on his heart. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold, dark skin of Marcus's hand. The ISO-E super scent was almost entirely gone, replaced by the sterile, metallic smell of the medical bay and the heavy, earthy scent of the garden mud that still clung to them both. "Don't go, Marcus," Elias whispered, his locks trailing into the blood on the floor. "The foundation isn't finished. The center needs its architect. You can't leave the site yet. Not like this." Mount Sinai's intensive care unit became the new war room. Aunt Viv had used her immense wealth and the weight of the Thorne name to clear an entire wing, filling it with private security and the best trauma surgeons in the tri-state area. The atmosphere was heavy, pressurized by the hum of ventilators and the rhythmic beep hiss of Marcus's life being sustained by machines. The walls were a sterile, eggshell white, a far cry from the exposed brick and warm timber of the Harlem sanctuary Marcus had been building. Marcus was in a medically induced coma. The bullet had shattered his clavicle and nicked the top of his lung, but the real danger was the internal hemorrhaging and the massive shock to his system. He looked like a statue of himself, cold, gray, and utterly rigid. Elias sat by the bed, a bowl of untouched Ghanaian goat stew sitting on the nightstand, its rich, spicy aroma now cold and congealed. The scent of the spices, ginger, cloves, and peanut, felt like a cruel mockery of the life they had been building only hours before. Elias stared at the cardiac monitor, mapping the green line as if it were an architectural drawing, searching for the structural integrity of Marcus's heart. Two days later, Sloane Kensington entered the ICU waiting room. She looked exhausted but triumphant, her bun slightly loosened, a few dark strands of hair framing her sharp, high cheekbones. She sat next to Aunt Viv, who was draped in a somber, midnight blue silk caftan, her emerald rings catching the cold light of the hospital lobby. Sloane's eyes were bright with the adrenaline of a successful hunt. "It's done," Sloane said, handing a thick manila folder to Viv. Silas Vance caved within 3 hours of being processed. He realized the general was going to use him as the fall guy for the arson. He's turned state's witness in exchange for a recommendation of leniency. He's given us the location of a black file he kept in a safe deposit box, receipts for every municipal contract the general influenced over the last decade. It's a roadmap of racketeering, bribery, and the digital files for the signature plotter. The general isn't just going to prison, he's going to be the lead story on every evening news broadcast for a month. And Cynthia? Viv asked, her voice a low, regal rasp that carried the weight of generations. Cynthia is a ghost, Sloane smirked, a predatory glint in her eyes. The board of her firm voted to terminate her for cause this morning. I've filed a civil suit for 10 times her net worth on behalf of Leo. By the time I'm finished, she won't be able to afford a subway tile, let alone a penthouse. She's currently being questioned by the SEC regarding the funds she moved to the General shell companies. The air in the holding cell at Central Booking smelled of floor wax, sour sweat, and the bitter dregs of cheap coffee. Silas Vance sat on the metal bench, his work jacket gone, replaced by a gray jumpsuit that made his medium-dark skin look sallow and aged. He wasn't the wrecking ball anymore. He was a man who had finally hit a load-bearing wall he couldn't break, and the realization was heavy in his chest. He heard the heavy rhythmic clank of the cell door. He didn't look up until he saw the hem of a vibrant floral African wax print dress. Mama Vance stood there, her head wrapped a crown of defiance, her eyes full of a sorrow so deep it looked like judgment. Behind her stood Elias, looking raw and hollowed out, his locks tied back with the leather cord Marcus loved. The silence between the three of them was a physical presence, a decade of unspoken words and missed milestones pressing against the plexiglass. "Silas," Mama Vance said, her voice a steady rhythmic thrum that demanded the truth. "Ruby," Silas whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. I didn't mean for it to go that far. The general, he said it was just a scare, a way to show the boy his true family. I thought I was protecting the Vance name." "You brought fire to my son's house, Silas," Mama Vance said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate level that made the other inmates go quiet. "You brought a gun to a garden where we grow food for children. You didn't just break a law. You broke the ancestral line. You tried to kill the man who loves your son. You tried to tear down a sanctuary because you were too afraid to look at the beauty in your own blood." Silas looked at Elias, his eyes searching his son's face for a glimmer of the boy who used to help him on job sites, the boy who used to draw flowers on the back of blueprints. He saw only a man who had been tempered in a fire Silas himself had lit. "Elias," Silas rasped, leaning his forehead against the cold plexiglass. "I spent my life thinking that if I didn't build you into something hard, you'd be crushed by a world that doesn't like men like us. I thought I was being a father. I was wrong. You're the strongest Vance I've ever seen. And Marcus, he didn't run. He stood in front of that gun for you. He's more of a man than I've ever been." Silas's hands shook as he pressed them against the glass. "I'm sorry. For the 10 years of silence. For the fire. For the words I used to cut you down. I've given the lawyer everything. The general is never coming out. Neither am I. I needed you to know that the garden was beautiful. Even when I was trying to hate it, it was beautiful." Back at the hospital, the night was a slow burn of sensory isolation. Elias was back in his chair, his head resting on the edge of Marcus's mattress. The room was dark, lit only by the blue and green glow of the monitors. He had brought a small bottle of Marcus's bespoke perfume, the grapefruit and ambroxan heavy scent, and had dabbed a tiny bit on his own wrists. He wanted Marcus to smell home, even in the depths of the coma. The clinical scent of the hospital was an invasive species, and Elias was determined to weed it out. "The moon is in Scorpio tonight, Marcus," Elias whispered into the silence, his voice a melodic anchor. "The house of death and rebirth. You've done the death part. It's time for the rebirth. The neighborhood is already clearing the site. Mrs. Higgins has a new pink umbrella, and she's out there every morning directing the cleanup. The teenagers are scrubbing the soot off the bricks with wire brushes. We're all just waiting for the architect to tell us where the first beam goes. We're waiting for you to tell us the story of what happens next." He played Jasmine Sullivan's Lions, Tigers, and Bears on his phone, the heavy, soulful bass vibrating the bedside table. He reached out and traced the sharp line of Marcus's jaw, feeling the slight stubble of a few days' growth. Marcus looked so peaceful, his face finally free of the rigid corporate mask. But the silence was terrifying. It was the silence of a building with no one inside. In a high-security interrogation room at the federal building, General Vance Sterling sat under the harsh glare of a single LED panel. He was still in his dark suit, but it was wrinkled, his dignity fraying at the edges like an old flag. Sloane Kensington sat opposite him, a digital recorder between them, her presence an architectural force that refused to let him hide. "You're done, Vance," Sloane said, her voice a razor that sliced through his remaining illusions. "Silas has flipped. The LIC warehouse has been processed by forensics. We have the metadata from the plotter showing the forgery was executed on your private laptop at 2:14 a.m. The Army is moving to strip your rank and garnish your pension to pay for Marcus Thorne's medical bills and Leo's trust fund. You're a private citizen now, Vance. And private citizens who forge documents and shoot architects go to the SHU." The general looked at her, his eyes cold and unblinking, a man who still believed his own lies. "Blueprints," he spat, the word sounding like a curse. "Blueprints and community. You think you've won because you have evidence? I was building a legacy that would have lasted a century. Marcus Thorne was a distraction, a flaw in the design." "No, Vance." Sloane leaned in, her eyes flashing with a predatory triumph that was purely Kensington. "You were the flaw. You tried to build a structure without a soul. You tried to replace a father's love with a plotter's precision. And in the end, it only took one architect and one organizer to watch you crumble into the mud." She clicked the recorder off. "Enjoy the silence, General. It's the only command you have left." Cynthia's penthouse was a crime scene of glass and failed ambition. White-gloved forensic accountants were carting away boxes of files, hard drives, and art pieces that had been bought with laundered funds. Cynthia stood in the center of her glass-walled living room, wearing a black silk slip dress, a glass of $1,000 cognac in her hand. Her platinum bob was disheveled, her ice-blue eyes bloodshot from a night of panic. Sloane entered, her heels clicking on the marble with a sound like a firing squad. She didn't say a word for a long time, just watched Cynthia's reflection in the glass. She finally handed Cynthia a stack of legal documents, a freeze on all her domestic and offshore assets, and a summons for a grand jury. "I built that firm, Sloane," Cynthia whispered, her voice a hollow shell. "I was the one who made Marcus Thorne a star. I gave him the right angles, and he threw it all away for a mud pit in Harlem." "He didn't throw it away, Cynthia," Sloane said, looking out at the Manhattan skyline with a look of bored superiority. "He traded a glass box for a fortress, something you wouldn't understand. By the way, the board didn't just fire you. They've invited Marcus to return as a senior partner once he recovers. They want his soul now. They want the Harlem aesthetic to be their new corporate identity. It turns out, authentic joy is the only thing trending in the market. Leo was sitting on the floor of the hospital room playing with his brass compass. He hadn't asked to see the general once. He hadn't asked about the Sterling way. He only asked one thing every morning. "Is Dad awake yet?" The boy's resilience was a structure all its own, built from the materials Marcus and Elias had provided over the last few weeks. Aunt Viv sat in the corner, reading a book to him, her silver hair catching the morning sun. Elias entered the room carrying 2 cups of tea and a small plant, a cutting from the Harlem garden that had somehow survived the fire. He saw Leo's small, hunched shoulders, and his heart broke again. He set the tea down and sat on the floor beside the boy, pulling him into his lap. "The needle is spinning, Elias," Leo said, holding the compass up. "It keeps going around and around. It can't find north." Elias wrapped his arms around Leo, resting his chin on the boy's curls. "The needle is just resting, Leo, like your dad. Sometimes, when the storm is too big, the compass needs a minute to remember which way home is. But do you know what north isn't just on that dial? It's in here." Elias tapped Leo's chest. "Your dad fought for us. He's the strongest building I know, and buildings like him, they always stand back up." Viv put her book down and knelt beside them, her emerald rings clicking against the brass as she touched Leo's hand. "We are the anchors, Leo," Viv said, her voice a regal comfort. "Elias and we're going to hold the ropes until your father is ready to take them back. You aren't a Sterling today, Leo. You're a Thorne. And thorns don't break. We grow." Leo leaned back into Elias's mustard yellow shirt, breathing in the scent of rosemary and earth. "Can we plant the flower for him, Elias, so he sees it when he wakes up?" "That's exactly what we're going to do, King," Elias whispered, kissing the top of the boy's head. Night 5. The hospital was quiet, a low-humming purgatory where time felt like it was suspended in amber. Elias was exhausted, his glowing skin looking dull and gray under the fluorescent lights. He had been refusing to leave the room for more than 5 minutes at a time, terrified that if he stepped out for even a second, Marcus would slip away into the static of the monitors. He had been talking to Marcus for hours about the zoning for the kitchen, about the types of peppers Elias wanted to plant in the spring, about the way the light hit the Harlem brownstones at sunset. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding Marcus's dark, calloused hand, when he felt it. A tiny, microscopic twitch of a finger against his palm. Elias froze. He didn't breathe. He waited, his heart performing a frantic rhythm. A second twitch, harder this time. A deliberate reach. "Marcus," Elias whispered, his voice a prayer. "Marcus, can you hear me? It's Elias. I'm right here. I'm holding you. Come back to the site, architect. We need you." The monitors began to change their rhythm. The beep hiss of the ventilator accelerated as Marcus's body began to fight the machine. His eyelids flickered, the dark, deep-set eyes struggling to push through the heavy fog of the sedation. "Nurse, I need a nurse in here. He's moving," Elias shouted, jumping to his feet and nearly knocking over the survival plant. Within seconds, the room was full of blue scrubs and the sharp professional commands of the night staff. Elias was pushed into the corner, his locks swinging as he watched the chaos. It was a terrifying mirror of the garden. The frantic movement, the high-stakes pressure, but this time, it was for a life, not against it. Marcus was fighting the tube in his throat, his body arching slightly, the rigid architect returning to life with a violent, instinctive surge. His hands were grasping at the hospital sheets, his dark skin slick with a sudden, heavy sweat. "He's coming out of it," the doctor shouted, checking the pupillary response. "Vitals are spiking, sedation is wearing off. He's trying to breathe on his own. Let's get the tube out carefully." Elias watched, tears of relief streaming down his face as they extubated Marcus. It was an ugly, visceral process, the sound of a man reclaiming his own breath from the machines. Marcus coughed, a deep, rattling sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the room. And for a second, his eyes flew wide, looking at the ceiling with a raw, primal terror. The sun began to rise over the East River, flooding the ICU room with a pale, hopeful gold that chased away the shadows of the last 5 nights. The machines had been turned down to a low hum, the frantic energy of the night replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Marcus was awake. He was pale, his breathing still shallow and pained, but he was there. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling with a look of profound, localized confusion. He looked like a man who had been dropped into a different dimension and was trying to calculate the physics of the air. The rigid corporate mask was gone, replaced by a vulnerability so deep it was hard to look at. Elias sat by the bed, his face radiant with a relief so pure it felt like a spiritual experience. He hadn't slept in 24 hours, but he felt more alive than he ever had. He reached out and gently brushed a stray hair from Marcus's forehead. "Hey," Elias whispered, his voice thick with joy. "Hey, architect, welcome back to the site. You had us worried there for a minute." Marcus slowly turned his head toward the voice. The movement was stiff, pained, his neck muscles straining against the bandages. He looked at Elias. He looked at the mustard yellow shirt, the shoulder-length locks, the warm, brown eyes that were currently swimming in tears. "Dad?" Leo was standing in the doorway, clutching his bear so tight the stuffing was coming out. He ran to the side of the bed, his small face lighting up like a Christmas tree. "Dad, you're awake. The compass is working again. Look, it's pointing right at you." Marcus looked at Leo, a flicker of something, recognition, love, a father's primal instinct passed over his face. A small, weak smile, barely more than a twitch, touched his lips. "Leo," Marcus rasped, his voice a dry, gravelly ghost of itself. My king, you're safe." Elias let out a sob of pure, unadulterated joy, his whole body shaking with the release. He reached out and stroked Marcus's forehead, his fingers trembling with the weight of the moment. "We've got you, Marcus. The general is gone. Silas is in jail. The garden is safe. We're going to rebuild. You did it. You saved us all." Marcus looked back at Elias. The smile he had given Leo didn't transfer. Instead, a look of profound, chilling vacancy settled over his features. He looked at Elias's hand on his forehead as if it were a foreign object, a piece of debris he hadn't accounted for in his blueprints. He didn't lean into the touch. He pulled back, his brow furrowing in a way that made his high cheekbones look like sharp ridges of stone. "Marcus?" Elias asked, the joy in his voice flickering like a dying candle in a drafty room. "What is it? Are you in pain? I'll call the doctor back. Marcus, look at me." Marcus didn't answer. He just stared at Elias, his deep-set dark eyes searching the organizer's face with a clinical, detached curiosity, but finding nothing. No memories of the jazz club. No memories of the rooftop fundraiser. No memories of the oxtail stew or the bath or the loud joy. The trauma of the shooting, combined with the shock of the coma, had created a localized blackout. The Saturn transit hadn't just tested the foundation, it had wiped the site clean. Where am I? Marcus asked, his voice cold and precise, the corporate architect returning in the total absence of the man. You're in the hospital, Marcus, Elias said, his heart starting to crack in a way he hadn't known was possible. It felt like the ground was liquefying beneath him. You were shot, at the garden, saving me, saving Leo. Don't you remember? Marcus looked around the room, his eyes fixing on the bowl of cold goat stew. He looked at the bottle of bespoke perfume on the nightstand. He looked at the African wax print bag Mama Vance had left. Everything looked too much. Everything looked chaotic and foreign. He looked like he was trapped in a building he hadn't designed. I remember the office, Marcus whispered, his voice gaining a terrifying, familiar edge of corporate steel. I remember the firm. I remember a man named Julian. We were in school together. He looked at Leo, a spark of the fatherly bond holding firm, then back at Elias. The vacancy in his eyes was absolute. It was a structural failure of the soul. Elias leaned in close, the scent of rosemary oil and ambroxan creating a bridge that Marcus refused to cross. Marcus, it's me. It's Elias. We live in Harlem. We're building the center together. We love each other. We're a family. You told me North was a feeling. Do you feel it? Elias reached for Marcus's hand, wanting to ground him, but Marcus instinctively pulled it away, his body becoming a rigid charcoal shield once again. He looked at Elias with a look of polite, distant confusion, the exact way he used to look at junior associates who missed a deadline or interns who spoke out of turn. The room went ice cold, despite the morning sun. The gold hitting the floorboards didn't feel like a blessing anymore. It felt like a spotlight on a ruin. Marcus looked Elias directly in the eye, his expression one of solemn, terrifying neutrality. I'm sorry, Marcus said, his voice as sharp and hollow as a glass box. Do I know you? Elias's world didn't shatter. It simply ceased to exist. He stood there, a man of soul, facing a man who had become a structure with no one inside.